Welcome to the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center's Curator's Corner. I'm Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center located in beautiful Glen Cove, New York. This online program is, as I think many of you know, part of a weekly series of short presentations that explore individual objects in our exhibition while our building is closed due to the corona crisis. Before I begin talking about any particular object this morning, let me invite you to use the Q&A feature of Zoom to pose any questions that come up during my presentation or while I'm talking, so during my presentation. I'll either answer them as I see them come up, or I'll wait and answer them at the end of the program. I will send around, I see somebody asking about my email. I will definitely send that out in just at the end of the program. I'll put it in my chat box or in the, so I'll make sure you guys all know it. It's ttritter@hmtcli.org. But again, I'll put it in one of the chats and responses so you can see it. Before I begin, let me also remind you of a fundraising drive that we've launched particularly to support our virtual programming. We are asking for 200 people to make $100 contributions, which will generate the $20,000 we need to support our online programming for the fall. And I want to thank many of you who've already donated, but if you haven't, I hope you'll go to our website at www.hmtcli.org and click the Give Now button. It'll help us make sure that we can continue doing our online programming while our building's closed. Today, I want to talk about an object in our first gallery, an elaborately decorated beer stein. And let me mention a special thanks to Neil and Gloria Barton, who donated the beer stein to us a number of years ago. Neil in particular developed a passionate interest in beer steins and collected hundreds of them over the years. Some were valuable because of the materials they were made from, others because how old they were or where they had been developed or used. But when he came across the beer stein that we have, he recognized its value was in opening a window into the dark history of anti-Semitism that existed in Europe in the 19th century. Neil passed away back in 2011, but I'm very grateful for Gloria's willingness to share information with me about her husband and about their family's beer stein collecting trips. This beer stein, as I said, sits in our first gallery where we give some background to anti-Semitism, and I think even a cursory glance at the beer stein makes the reasons for its placement in that section of our museum pretty clear. Anti-Semitism, of course, goes back a long way, perhaps even to the beginning of Judaism, but most scholars talk about modern anti-Semitism as something that emerged in the second half of the 19th century. Interestingly, after Jews had attained equal rights in Western and Central European countries. The case in Europe is somewhat similar to the blossoming of racism seen in America after the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which secured African Americans the right to vote and citizenship. So for example, the Ku Klux Klan in America emerges after the end of the Civil War. The peak of lynching happens in America in the 1890s and early 19-teens. So again, after the abolition of slavery, after the securing of the right to vote. And in Europe, it was after Jews had legal protections that there's a new wave of anti-Semitism that blossomed in Western and Central Europe. And that's the period when our beer stein was made. The beer stein was made in around 1890 or 1892 in the German town of Horgrenzhausen, one of the centers of European pottery making dating back to the 1500s. It was manufactured by the firm of Dümmler and Bryden, which had been formed in 1883 by Peter Dümmler, an established ceramicist, and his brother-in-law, Albert Bryden, a technician who took responsibility for the production end of the business. As this catalog cover shows from around 1890, they had built a significant factory that they put on their catalog. They had agents in a number of major German cities, and they were selling for both the domestic and, they specifically say, the export market as well. The Stein in our collection has a lot going on in its decorations. It's elaborate. So let me take a look and show you a few things on it. I'd like to start with the lid, which includes 5 quotes around the central word heil, which could be translated as health or good health. The first quote I want to talk about is the one from Field Marshal Helmuth von Moltke, who wrote, "The Jews form a state in a state." The quote actually comes from an 1832 essay about Poland, but more important than the actual context of this, for this Stein's design was simply the name Moltke, one of the heroes of the 19th century in Prussia and a well-known name in 1890 when our beer stein was made. Helmuth von Moltke was referred to today, or is referred to today, as Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, because there are actually 3 relatively significant Helmuth von Moltkes. The first, the Elder, the guy who is quoted on our beer stein, was the chief of staff of the Prussian army for 30 years and was famous as a Prussian military commander in several wars, including the Franco-Prussian War, which paved the way for German unification in 1871. The second, known as Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, was the nephew of the Elder, and became the chief German General Staff from 1906 until 1914 during World War I. So a significant military leader in his own right. The third famous Helmuth von Moltke is Helmuth James von Moltke, who was the great-grandnephew of the Elder and became one of the leaders of a group opposed to Hitler and Nazi rule in the 1930s. He was a German lawyer in the 1930s who declined the chance to become a German judge to avoid having to join the Nazi Party, and instead opened a law practice in Berlin, which particularly helped victims of Hitler's regime get out of Germany. In 1942, he helped found the Kressau Circle, a group that gathered in his home to oppose Hitler and think about ways to oppose Hitler. When the Nazis identified who he was and what he was doing, they arrested him, tried him as a traitor, and then executed him. In 1890, when our beer stein was made, of course, the only Helmuth von Moltke that anybody knew about was the Elder. But ironically, I think, the name that is here used to celebrate anti-Semitism becomes a name associated with trying to fight against Hitler. So an interesting event. A second quote on our lid comes from Friedrich Schiller, a German poet, historian, and playwright who lived in the end of the 18th century, and much of his life he spent in Weimar. And indeed, Schiller is associated with a flowering of German ideas and culture that historians refer to as Weimar classicism. The quote, which you can see here, just to the right of the Moltke quote, translates to, "Contemptuous is the nation which doesn't enthusiastically apply everything for its honor." It's not a particularly anti-Semitic quote, and indeed Schiller is not today thought of as one of the leading anti-Semites of the 18th century. Indeed, there is some irony, I think, that Schiller and Weimar classicism could be celebrated in this 1890s beer stein, because by the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler actually banned any productions of Schiller's plays because he didn't think there was, or he opposed some of Schiller's ideas about freedom and expression. Still, the wording of the quote, the celebration of honor, was something that the Nazis and the Nazi ideology would later come to embrace. A third quote on the beer stein comes from Martin Luther and says, "Trust no fox on the meadow and no Jew on his oath." Martin Luther, of course, is the father of Lutheranism, who launched the Protestant Reformation in 1517 with the posting of 95 theses about Catholic Church abuses, for which he was excommunicated. Luther, clearly one of the great thinkers of the 16th century, but also known for a number of anti-Semitic statements, and this is just one of them. I'll add that in the 1930s, the same quote was used as the title for a rabidly anti-Semitic children's book that was published in Germany and that we have a few pages from in our gallery. The font may make it hard to read the title, but I assure you that the title is that same quote from Luther. Two more quotes to mention on the lid. to the left of the Martin Luther quote is a quote attributed to a J. Decker from Vienna. And to be honest, I have tried to find out who this J. Decker is or what this quote comes from, and I have been so far unsuccessful. But the quote says, "A Christian should and must be anti-Semitic." I don't know if this was a Pastor Decker. There are some references in the historical record to a Pastor Decker in Vienna or a Mr. Decker. I just don't know. But that's the quote. And the last quote comes from Otto von Bismarck, a much more famous figure, and says, "I would hide my head in shame if I had to give an account and answer to a Jewish judge." Bismarck was the Prussian statesman who was the architect of unified Germany, a unified Germany in 1871, and the creator of what the Nazis called the Second Reich. The quote comes from Bismarck's comments in an 1847 debate about a new law which was being proposed to emancipate the Jews in Prussia and give them equal rights. Bismarck was against the law, although he actually agreed that Jews should have all kinds of personal liberties and civil rights. But he didn't like the idea that Jews could be judges and make decisions over Christians. Time and experience, however, changed Bismarck's views. A few years later, in the 1870s, he confessed that he had heard and delivered many stupid speeches at the Diet of 1847, where this quote comes from. And in action, as a Prussian minister of state, he accepted the full emancipation of Jews which came through the revolution in 1848, and later publicly stated, "I shall never consent to any attempt at curtailing the constitutional right of the Jews." I point this out only to say that these 5 quotes are cherry-picked from history to emphasize a particularly anti-Semitic view. The quotes on the top could have been chosen differently. Quotes from these same people could have been chosen differently to create a different impression. But Dummler and Bryden sought out particularly these anti-Semitic quotes when they were designing this beer stein. Perhaps more powerful than the quotes on the top, however, is the decoration on the rest of the beer stein. And I want to draw your attention down to a series of 5 caricatures that ring the top of the portion of the beer stein, separated by a few anti-Semitic slogans or sayings. I've tried to zoom in on some of these so you can see them a little more clearly than in the large photograph. You can see here Judas Plitus, Judas the Bankrupt, or Cohn the Swindler. Note the exaggerated hooked noses, the frog-like eyes, the bizarre hats, all of these stereotypical signs of Jews. These features are continued in the other 3 pictures or caricatures of the Order of Levi, Nathan the Miser, and Mammon, greed. Even if you couldn't read the quotes or recognize the quotes on the top of the beer stein, I think anyone who picked up this or looked at this beer stein would see these Jewish caricatures as dangerous and scary. Perhaps not coincidentally, they actually look similar to imagery from 19th century Europe depicting the devil or Satan. The final imagery on the beer stein, the largest part of the decoration, are these 2 scenes. On one side, the Jews are depicted as they are thrown out of Germany. The regal figure personifying the German Empire says, "Raus aus Deutschland," get out of Germany. And like in the caricatures above, you can see the Jews are shown here with exaggerated stereotypical features of big noses and bulging eyes. There are also a couple of other elements to the imagery. Several Jews are shown with big bags of money. One is labeled deposits and another says 600,000 on it. Also note the dogs have the exaggerated features as if Jewish dogs were somehow different than other dogs. On the other side, there is a depiction of where the Jews are going, labeled as Das Gelobt, the promised land. There are also references to the land of milk and honey. And a label at the bottom that says, "Welcome to Israel's empire." In the background, you might notice there's also what appears to be the golden calf, a biblical reference. Here's a slightly larger view of this image, and you can see that the largest feature on this scene is a bank, the Aaron Gojimschachter Vessel Bank, as if the main thing Jews want in their homeland is a place to store all their money. So that's the imagery on our beer stein. I think powerful, but horrendous and unpleasant. One obvious question arises from the elaborate decoration, which is why put this stuff here? Why put these kinds of anti-Semitic stereotypical depictions on a beer stein? And I think the answer tells us a lot about Germany in the 1890s. First, the fact that the manufacturer believed a beer stein like this would sell shows that Jews, regardless of their legal rights in Germany, were seen as different than other German Christians in the 1890s. They were clearly seen by some at least as outsiders or as the other. Second, the imagery on the beer stein, all the anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes, I think they show that those tropes were clearly well established by the 1890s and widely understood. People purchasing this beer stein, this mass-produced beer stein, understood what was being shown. There was general knowledge about the symbolism that is included here and about these stereotypes. And the third thing about this beer stein is it shows how acceptable anti-Semitism was in Germany in the 1890s. This was not something to purchase and hide in a closet. This was something for drinking in at the local beer garden. So people would have taken it down, been with their buddies, openly used this beer stein. It was not a decoration to just put on the shelf. But what did it actually mean to drink from this beer stein? Did you have to hate Jews to drink from this beer stein, to own this beer stein? I'm not sure. Initially, I think you probably would say yes. I mean, who else would purchase this or use something like this except for somebody who really had a hatred for the Jewish community? But, oops, I've shown you where I'm going. But some of the recent discussions about the imagery we Americans have celebrated in recent decades has made me think more about this. And perhaps this is a bit off topic, but I've been thinking about these two images. On the left is Chief Wahoo, the Cleveland Indians logo that was changed in 2018. And the right is the logo for the team, the football team formerly known as the Washington Redskins, which is being changed this year. I realize that these are very different from the imagery shown on our beer stein, and that we live in very different times today than in the 1890s when our beer stein was produced. But I don't think most of the fans of the Cleveland Indians or the Washington Redskins are outwardly or were outwardly anti-Native American. They could easily proudly have sported these logos on shirts, hats, even beer mugs, and really not thought about what they were doing by sharing these imagery. Perhaps Germans could similarly have drank from this anti-Semitic beer stein and not really thought about the imagery on it or what it meant. Perhaps also anti-Semitism was so omnipresent that non-Jews didn't think much about showing off that anti-Semitism. But the fact is, in practice, the use of this beer stein could only have helped spread anti-Semitic views. And in practice, the use, and the fact is that all too easily, we separate people from one another, separate groups with categories, develop stereotypes, and create others. It's all too easy to do, and this beer stein was part of that process. So what do I take away from this beer stein? For me, the beer stein really tells me about three main ideas. First, anti-Semitism goes a long way back. It's not something that Hitler created in the 1930s. It was certainly around in the 1890s when this beer stein was produced, and indeed goes back much earlier than that, and we know that. Another point, though, that this beer stein brings or makes clear to me is that anti-Semitism alone does not explain the Holocaust. Despite the fact that anti-Semitic ideas were circulating in the 1890s and widely accepted, there was no genocide in the 1890s. And indeed, in the following 30 years, many Jews in Germany assimilated and felt they were no longer the outsiders. They felt after the 1890s, in the early 1900s, 1920s, they felt German. And that's the third point, again, about how just anti-Semitism doesn't explain the Holocaust. It took something more than just anti-Semitism to spark the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism was certainly a factor, but it existed earlier when there had not been any mass effort to annihilate the Jewish community. So in thinking about the causes for the Holocaust, we need to look for what was different in Germany in the 1930s than in the 1890s, because it's in those differences that we can find some of the reasons that enabled the Holocaust to happen. That, however, is a much bigger question, and one that we try to answer through the totality of our museum exhibition and in our virtual tours. So I'm going to stop there. I hope you've gotten some sense about the elaborate decoration on this one beer stein. And again, if you have questions, please type them in. I will respond in just a minute. I also want to mention a few of our other upcoming programs. This coming Sunday on the 13th at 7 p.m., we are going to be holding a virtual fireside chat with the author Meryl Ain about her new novel, The Takeaway Men, which explores the impact of immigration, identity, prejudice, and secrets on Holocaust survivors and their children. The discussion is going to be moderated by a professor from Touro College, Thane Rosenbaum, and will also include Holocaust survivor Irving Roth. Next Monday, September 14th at 6 p.m., we're offering one of our monthly virtual tours, virtual gallery tours, which, as I said, explore some of the factors other than anti-Semitism that enabled the Holocaust to happen and give you the experience of seeing our museum even though our building is closed. And one more program to mention, next Tuesday, September 15th at 11 a.m., our scholar in residence, Dr. Linda Berghardt, will be giving a talk as part of our Yiddish culture series entitled Love, Laughter, and Latkes, the Golden Age of the Catskills. As she says, the entertainment was A-list, the nonstop food was kosher, and the impact on American culture profound. You can find a full list of these programs and how to register for them on our website at www.hmtcli.org under the Events tab. And again, I will ask you to also click on our website and go to the Give Now and make a contribution of $100 to help us generate the money we need to support virtual programming like this and like the other programs I've listed that are coming up this fall. Okay, let me look at some of your questions. And I will put right now into the chat window my email. Oops. So that if you want to email me any questions or ask other information, I will put that out to you. Sorry for my delay. And there we go. Do you know if there are certain kinds of circumstances or events that tend to occur before certain people engage in anti-Semitic, racist, and or biased events today? I think that's a broad question. I don't think there's a singular answer, but I know historically, and this is the point I was making, that in the past, historically, after equal rights have been given either to the Jews in Europe or to African Americans in America, after there's legal rights provided by the state, there has historically been a backlash and the creation of a new wave of anti-Semitism in Europe or racism in America against African Americans. That's what we saw in the wake of the abolition of slavery. So sometimes the legal protections and the removal of those barriers doesn't necessarily change people's racist views, and those are sustained. But I don't know of any particular kind of circumstances or events that would, always bring up racism or anti-Semitic behavior. Obviously, at times of stress, people look for blame, and we know there are scapegoats, and people turn to those scapegoats. One more question here. Were beer steins like this popular throughout Germany or only in specific areas of the country? The firm that made this beer stein was circulating nationally in Germany, making beer steins nationally. We don't know, I don't have obviously sales records for where they sold, but I think if it was only being sold in a small part of Germany, they wouldn't have been producing it in the same way they were. So I think these were being used all across Germany and even beyond Germany's borders. I will say, though, that we know there were certain areas which later on tended to have stronger participation or endorsement of the Nazi Party by the 1930s, like Bavaria and the South. So there were certainly areas that had stronger stronger sense of anti-Semitism than others. By the time we get to the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, Berlin is seen as a place of particular tolerance, which becomes a target of Nazi crackdown as they remake the capital of Berlin and turn it into a Nazi ideologically driven city. One more question. Do we know if this is something someone would just grab off the shelf in a store? Were beer steins collectible? Do you think this is one of a kind thing? No. These were mass produced, and the way that this company, Daimler and Bryden, sold was through factors, through agents who were operating in different cities in Germany. So they would have had displays. They would have taken them probably to fairs as well, but they would have had displays, probably shops in different cities that didn't only carry Daimler and Bryden stuff, but other beer steins as well. And then people would have come and, yeah, bought them off the shelf, or at some kind of fair where somebody was just selling them like that, or asked for a catalog and asked for it from the factory directly. That's also possible. Okay, well, thanks very much for participating and for your questions, and I look forward to seeing you at some of our other events very soon. I wish you a very good day. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.